All right, guys, we are back in my garage for another video. And yes, I would estimate that probably 95% of B58 owners, including myself, are running port injection wrong. A lot of you guys have reached out to me because you might have seen different comments on social media and stuff indicating that that's true. And I will say, yes, it is the case, but it's all right. I realize I need to say this more often because a lot of people out there will try to convince you that if you're not doing things the absolute best, most expensive, most complicated way, then there's absolutely no reason to do it at all. But in reality, a lot of us fell in love with the B58 platform because just like the style of port injection most of us run, it's cheaper, it's easier, and it still works. So in this video, I'm going to share a little bit more information on why there is a better way, quote unquote, to run port injection and why I still run it the way that I do. And a lot of you should be fine running it the way you do as well. So let's go ahead and talk about it. And hopefully you guys find this video useful. Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future. So to start off, let's make sure we have the same basic understanding of how a direct injection system works. So everything starts in your fuel tank. You've got, 14 or 16 plus gallons of fuel sitting in your tank. And it starts off by getting pressurized by your low pressure fuel pump. So that's the fuel pump that sits in your tank that sucks up the fuel and pumps it towards the front of your engine bay to get it to your engine. Now, once it gets to the front of your engine, there is a high pressure fuel pump that's mounted on your engine, and that increases the fuel pressure from around 70 to 80 psi up to 2,900 psi on a Gen 1 or up to 5,000 psi on a Gen 2. And then that high pressure fuel goes to your DI injectors and that sprays directly into the combustion chamber. Now, a big change that came with direct injection systems is this high pressure fuel system. And it's required because you could see hundreds of psi of pressure inside your combustion chamber. So you need really high fuel pressure in order to overcome that consistently. So keep that in mind. We will come back to that concept a little bit later, but the biggest difference going to a direct injection system compared to an older port injected car is that you need to get into the thousands of psi in order to spray your fuel effectively. Now, port injection comes into play for a lot of different reasons. You'll see some OEMs adding port injection back to their cars that were starting out as direct injection just to help with things like emissions. In low load scenarios, they'll spray fuel from port injectors to help keep the intake valves clean and reduce carbon buildup so that your car can run more efficiently and effectively in those low load scenarios. But then on the aftermarket side, most of us are strictly looking for more power. And as you want to make more boost or run bigger turbos, there's always going to be a limitation on the direct injection system. The low pressure fuel pump has a limitation, the high pressure fuel pump has a limitation, and the injectors have a limitation. Now, the port injectors specifically skirt around the limitations of your high pressure fuel pump and your injectors. So it can't compensate for low pressure fuel pump limits, but it can bypass the DI system that's on top of your engine and spray extra fuel through 6 additional injectors coming in from the side of your intake. But the benefit at that point is not only are you bypassing the limitations of your direct injection system, but you also virtually have unlimited fuel opportunity at that point. You can swap to bigger injectors. They're all off-the-shelf components that are readily available to find. And you can even add a second fuel rail if you need to. So you could have 12 additional injectors spraying into your intake to completely flood the car with as much fuel as you need. So the opportunities are endless once you go that route. Now, I must reiterate that the need for port injection isn't 100% dictated by, if you want to run E85, you need port, or if you want to run this big turbo, you need port. None of that is a 100% definitive rule. You really need to understand both what fuel you want to run and how much power you want to make before you determine that port injection is necessary, because there definitely is going to be a way to make a lot of power without port injection. In the past, it was kind of more of a default answer because we didn't have DI upgrades, but now we have a lot of high pressure fuel pump upgrade options, injector upgrade options. You can make 700 or 800 plus horsepower without port injection nowadays. So it really just depends on your goals, how you drive your car, and what your budget is. But I know port injection is still a very popular option option just because it completely bypasses the limitations of the high pressure fuel system. Now, the way to install port injection is relatively simple in concept. So you have a low pressure feed line going from your fuel pump in the tank up to your high pressure fuel pump in your engine bay. And somewhere along that line, you want to add a T-fitting. So that will split your fuel feed going to the high pressure fuel pump and add an additional outlet that's going to your secondary fuel rail or your spacer plate where you have 6 additional port injectors. So this completely bypasses all the fuel that's going to your DI system by adding those 6 additional injectors. And they're going to see the same 70 to 80 PSI that your low pressure fuel pump is putting out. And this is kind of where the problem comes into play, because with your spacer plate or with your fuel rail in the setup, it's going to be completely capped off. It's going to have a dead end on one side and all of the fuel is going to the injectors. And this works great in most scenarios because our cars make a lot of fuel pressure. The injectors are typically rated for around 43 PSI and our fuel systems run again 70 to 80, which actually increases the amount of flow that your injectors can make compared to the rated pressure. But it's not 100% dependent on the fuel pressure coming into the injector. What we are also concerned about is what's called differential pressure. The differential pressure is the difference between the fuel pressure behind the injector and the air pressure in front of the injector, or in our case, how much boost you're running. So if you're running 20, 30, 40 PSI, that manifold is going to have boost pressure built up inside of it, and that's actively pushing against the fuel pressure when your injector's open on the port injection side. And you might see where I'm going here, but it's really important to make sure that the fuel pressure behind the injector is high enough over the boost pressure in front of the injector so that the difference makes up that same 43 PSI that the injector is rated for. Otherwise, if the difference gets smaller, the fuel flow gets smaller and you actually start flowing less fuel than it's rated for. So for example, let's say we had a more traditional fuel system that was running at 43.5 PSI. If you wanted to turn up your turbo to make 43.5 PSI or 44 PSI, effectively when the injector opened, no fuel would come out. It might even be a little bit of boost pressure pushing back into the fuel system. And that's because you have so much pressure in front of it that the fuel can't effectively spray and get the fuel out of the injector. So that difference is what you're really worried about. Your fuel pressure minus your boost pressure needs to be greater than 43.5 PSI. Now, for most people, I just tell them if you're starting to push your turbo over 35 PSI, that's when this becomes a bottleneck. Again, most of us are running around 70 to 80 PSI. So if you're able to keep it at 80 PSI, it's a little less risky. If you're running lower, closer to 70 PSI, it's more risky. But effectively, once you start getting into those mid 30 PSI range, you're going to start losing fuel flow on the port injection side. And that's where the upgrade becomes a lot more important. So what can you do about it? Well, here's the idea. You need a way for fuel pressure to increase as boost pressure increases. So as you start running over 35 PSI, 40 PSI, 45 PSI, you need fuel pressure to increase at the same rate so that you always have a large enough differential pressure to get the target fuel flow that you're looking for. Yes, you can run bigger and bigger injectors, but you still need adequate pressure behind them for them to spray effectively. So it's critical to make sure that this is good. So the way that you do this is by adding an adjustable fuel pressure regulator. And what you can do is just remove the block off plug on the end of your fuel rail, install a fuel pressure regulator, and then you're going to have to run a secondary line all the way back from the port injection rail back into your fuel tank. And what that's going to do is slowly bleed off some fuel and let that flow back to the fuel tank to keep fuel pressure in check. If it's completely closed up and not letting any fuel back, it's maximizing the absolute most fuel pressure you can create, but it's always going to be bleeding some fuel back to keep that fuel pressure in check. So that's where we're able to see at least above the 80 PSI that the car typically targets. But there's another thing that you can do. A big advantage comes from completely separating your DI and PI fuel systems, and that even starts in the fuel tank. A lot of us run a secondary fuel pump for additional flow because as you add port injection, you're probably going to hit the limits of your low pressure fuel pump pretty quickly as well. But if you're adding a secondary pump or, even a triple pump setup, you can use those separate pumps as strictly a supply for the port injection system. So you'll have a separate feed line instead of trying to split it off from the existing feed line that's going to your high pressure fuel pump. You can have a completely separate one that runs just from your secondary low pressure fuel pumps up to your port injection rail, and then the return will flow back into the fuel tank. So now you'll pretty much have 3 fuel lines going from the fuel pump all the way up to the engine bay to make everything work as effectively and safely as possible. So you can see, 1, there's a lot more components involved. 2, it's a lot more complicated of an install, and it requires some adjustment because you're going to want to set up a boost reference for the fuel pressure regulator so it can increase fuel pressure as boost increases and keep fuel pressure up. But that's really the only way to get around those limits if you're trying to shoot for higher horsepower levels. So if you're like me, at most you're running in the low 30s of PSI, it's a lot less risky, a lot less of an issue. And like I said, the standard port injection setup just works. It's really simple and easy and makes the power that we're looking for. But once you start pushing past 35 PSI on any turbo, that's when you're going to start seeing the need to do this kind of setup to make sure your port injectors are flowing what they're rated for. And here's kind of a diagram that I tried to make to draw it all out. So again, you've got your primary low pressure fuel pump, the stock low pressure fuel pump, running to your high pressure fuel pump and going to your DI system just like normal. But you'll have a secondary Walbro 450 or 525, whatever it is, and that will have its own dedicated fuel line that will go to the port injection rail. And then from that rail, you'll have a fuel pressure regulator that controls how much fuel is flowing back to the fuel tank. And that will have a boost reference that keeps fuel pressure up and high enough at your max boost level to make sure your low pressure fuel system is in check. The only thing that you want to do here, again, like I always recommend, run something like a reflex. That'll make sure that your low pressure fuel pump is triggering at the right time so that it builds up fuel pressure in advance of your port injectors turning on, and all of that should pretty much work in harmony. So this is kind of the ideal setup. When people say the best setup or the right way to do port injection, this is what they're talking about. So hopefully this makes sense to you guys. 1, why it's better, and 2, why most of us don't need it. Again, if you're not pushing for mid to high 30 PSI levels, regardless of the turbo you're running, this is pretty much a non-issue in my opinion. Most people are very easily getting away with the just T-fitting going into a capped off fuel rail or spacer plate and making a little bit of extra power. But if you are shooting for big numbers and you want to break records and all that good stuff, this is the idea you should have in the future for what your build will need to include if you want your fuel system to work as effectively as possible. So hopefully this answers the questions you guys might have. Also, hopefully this explains a little bit more about the MHD setup and how they're managing, differential pressure and monitoring that with the Motive Reflex. If you want to hear more about that, let me know and we can talk more about those reflex options in a future video. But otherwise, I think that's it for this one. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.